So to give everybody just a little bit of background about me, I am a community archaeologist. So practicing archaeologist, quite active and have my hand in a number of projects and things. But pretty much the basis of the community archaeology that I do is sustainable archaeology. So to explain what that is, I am going to give kind of the quick and dirty academic breakdown of community archaeology and sustainable archaeology, talk about my current research, and then talk about my future and where things are going. So community archaeology is an effort by archaeologists to take the advantages made in public archaeology and progress further. So community archaeology seeks to incorporate local people in all aspects of the archaeological enterprise. A community, as opposed to the rather generic or vague public, is a social group of varied size who share common characteristics and is perceived to belong to a distinct segment of society. So packed within this definition are many implications and variations from project to project. This is to be expected of a technique that has emerged more or less independently in all projects all over the world, and which by nature must be highly reflexive and responsive to particular archaeological sites and its associated communities. There are, however, some factors that are common to all archaeology projects. So an emphasis on polyvocality and genuine two-way dialogue between archaeologists and the affected public, and an investment in empowering communities in political, social, and/or material ways. An archaeological site is a representation, an archaeological site and its representative history, generally has more than one community, which can lay claims to it. This is what makes community archaeology a challenging experience. And as an archaeologist seeking to incorporate the community in all aspects of the project, one must address and recognize all the communities involved, which may be complicated if there are communities that feel culturally connected to the heritage that are not only officially connected to the historical narrative. So an archaeologist has to be open to challenges he or she will face while trying to truly be collaborative. For example, not all communities want to be involved in bringing up their past. So because of the emphasis on collaboration, community archaeology is deeply frustrating, extremely time-consuming, humbling, and challenging in unanticipated ways. But the end product ends up being extremely rewarding. This form of archaeology creates an opportunity to ask questions of the past, which may not have been considered or celebrated if not for the dialogue surrounding archaeological heritage. It creates an avenue for communities to ask questions of the past that are relevant to their present and questions which can empower silenced communities. So community empowerment. My approach to community archaeology has been community empowerment through my research. So community empowerment refers to the process of enabling communities to increase control over their lives. Communities are groups of people that may or may not be spatially connected, but who share common interests, concerns, or identities. These communities could be local, national, or international with specific or broad interests. And empowerment refers to the process by which people gain control over the factors and decisions that shape their life. It is the process by which they increase their assets and attributes and build capacities to gain access, partners, networks, and/or a voice in order to gain control. Enabling implies that people cannot be empowered by others. They only empower themselves by acquiring more of power's different forms. It assumes that people are their own assets, and the role of the external agent is to catalyze, facilitate, or accompany the community in acquiring this power. So as such, as the archaeologist, I see myself as the one accompanying or facilitating the community in this process. So sustainable archaeology. It's archaeology that takes account of social and environmental practices, addresses the needs of stakeholders while accounting for capacity building within localized industries. So specifically, it's 4 pillars in this. It's ecological, economic, social, and cultural sustainability. So community stakeholders are partners in the formation of the research design. It also means development in harmony with the ecological process, so conservation and protection of natural resources as we're doing this work. Looking at cultural heritage stewardship and preservation, and training local stakeholders in archaeology and heritage practice. So in all of my work that I do, I try to incorporate all aspects of this process. So taking it from this generalized concept of doing community archaeology to actually doing sustainable. So something that is going beyond just the act of excavating, but contributing back and looking at the process in which archaeology is undergoing. So to start out with the projects and kind of some of my research, my initial research project is the Morningstar Tabernacle number 88 Order of Moses Cemetery. I started this project 13 years ago. So I'm not sure who's familiar with the Maryland area, but the location of my site is in Cabin John, Maryland, which is located on the side of 495 Beltway. It's currently between Georgetown and Potomac, Maryland, for anybody who knows the region. In the late 1800s, one of the first African-American families to settle in Cabin John were the Gibsons. As enslaved persons, they ran away from Virginia to DC seeking freedom. Once reunited, they began to save their money, and they purchased property in the Cabin John area. It is believed that Mr. Moore, who was a prominent landowner and enslaver of the time, right afterwards sold 5 plots on 7 Locks Road to 10 African-American families, and the Gibsons were one of those that purchased, but the other families were believed to have at one point been enslaved by him. In 1897, the Gibsons decided to donate a portion of their property to be used for the construction of a church for the community, and this became known as the Gibson Grove AME Zion Church, which was established in 1898 by the African Americans living in Cabin John. So just to give you a little bit of history of Gibson Grove, which is the name that this African American community donned inside the larger community of Cabin John. So the first Gibson Grove church was a log structure. In 1923, the log cabin was replaced with a structure that is still standing today. And in 1998, it celebrated its historic centennial anniversary and was added to Montgomery County's historic sites list. However, in 2002, Gibson Grove had its closing ceremonies as it no longer had enough people in the community to sustain the actual congregation. With its dwindling, the AME Zion Church gave the property over to a new congregation, which was the First Agape AME Zion Church. So just to give you kind of an idea, this is 7 Locks Road in Cabin John, Maryland, and right within the red arrow is the only property that was sold to African Americans. After Mr. Moore, and you can see his name just directly off to the left of the red square. After he sold this property, all the other landowners placed restrictions in their deeds that said you could not sell to colored folks. So these were the only parcels that at the time were sold to African Americans, and it was known as number 10, and it was because later it became 10 plots that were owned by African Americans, but it was also located next to lock number 10. And if you know anything about the C&O Canal, it has little locks along it. And lock 10 was also located just south of this area. So we know what we know about the church because we actually have the deed of 1881, where Sarah Gibson actually writes over that this church will be used for colored folks to worship in. So we see the deed and we can see her handing over the property. This is currently the church as it stands today with some of the original trustees. So upon it closing and it transferring over, this was the property that transferred over to the First Agape Church. And then what we see is on Ash Wednesday in 2004, a fire destroys the church. Now the fire only destroys the interior of the church. The outside structure was still preserved. So in 2008, the church finally raised enough money to have the church structure renovated. However, renovation plans were halted due to one of the older church members mentioning that her family had been buried on the church property years ago. I met with the current church representatives frequently to discuss the project's development and ask for their input on how the project could proceed. I used their concerns and ideas as development for the project design. And due to the unusual circumstances of ownership of the property, I wanted the current church congregation to be left with a feeling of pride in taking on the legacy of their new property. The church and the White family, who was the family that was believed to have the descendants buried there, wanted the skeletal remains to be buried in Moses Hall Cemetery. A week before the excavations were scheduled, I took a tour of Moses Hall Cemetery in order to survey the area in which the bodies were to be repatriated. Well, at the time, I was under the impression that this was a historic cemetery that was receiving proper care and maintenance. After a half-a-mile uphill hike, I walked into a mini overgrown forest with plants, bamboo, poison ivy, and bushes, and trash scattered along the cemetery adjacent to the fence. At the time, I was under the impression that the current church, that the property had belonged to the current church. And what I later found out was the cemetery was privately owned by the Morningstar Tabernacle number 88, Grand United Order of Sons and Daughters, Brothers and Sisters of Moses Hall, which had been an African-American benevolent society. And the last living member was an older woman whose family members were buried on the church property. And that's the information that we had, at least back in 2008. And I will kind of go and show you how with community archaeology that has since been revised. So I toured the cemetery with another archaeologist. We noticed that there were a number of roughly 30 visible graves. As we walked through the bush, there were several more that were less visible, and there were newer graves placed on top of older graves. We recognized that in order to rebury skeletal remains of those buried, that there would need to be a clearing and cleaning of the cemetery. So the following week, I began a campaign to involve the whole community. I called a few of the former congregation members, as well as the last remaining member of the order, in order to get their permission to clean and clear the cemetery for repatriation purposes. All parties agreed. Younger members of the family came out and volunteered for the cleanup, in addition to the Cabin John Association, which is the community association that was located around. The Montgomery County Parks and Planning Archaeology Division came out and volunteered. My own family came out and volunteered. So the cleanup basically took place over a day, and we had over 40 volunteers that came out that day. In addition to that, what we held was a community day just to kind of answer general questions and also ask the community general questions. 1 week preceding this, the archaeological investigations began. And this began in early June. It was interesting because of the effort I put out in kind of involving everybody in the community. The Archaeology Society, the local ASM, came out and wanted to volunteer to help do this work and excavate and look And there was, if you actually look in the top picture, you see a lot of trees, a lot of bush. There's a lot of disturbance to this area, and there are actually tree roots that are running along the side of the church. So all of these trees that kind of popped up, and there's a lot of root action just kind of taking along the whole hill. So one of the concerns was there's not going to be any burials. If they were, they'll probably be disturbed due to the trees, due to the bushes. So we proceeded with running some STPs. We ran along, we did a couple of quite deep trenches in the back, and this is based off of the ethnographic information we received from Ms. White. Unfortunately, there were no indicators of grave shafts. And even in addition to this, what we later found out was that the maps of the site were actually inaccurate for that time period, and the portion of the church property had been sold off to developers. So on our community archaeology day, we talked further with members of the community to just let them know so they could actually tour the site, but also giving them tours of the cemetery in order to get community buy-in, in order to get people to be more concerned and more active in the work that was taking place at the cemetery, and to just recognize that this was a site that they should all care about. A number of the current property owners didn't even realize there was a cemetery behind, like directly behind their homes. So this became quite interesting with their involvement, and then finding out, because they actually took it as a positive and not as a negative. And you could just imagine how some property owners finding out that there's a whole graveyard behind your back window would make people uneasy, but it didn't for this particular community. As this project continued, basically the church was free. They were able to go and move forward with any work they wanted to do. However, in 2021, I ended up coming back to this project. And the reason why is the current dilemma of 495. Basically, it was proposed by MDOT, so Maryland Department of Transportation, that they were going to run through a portion of this cemetery. And they had created new plans to expand the highway, which meant that they were going to literally cut and bisect a huge portion of the cemetery. And so just to give you a visual of what we're talking about, the highway is right here. And I'm gonna grab a pointer. I'm sorry for everybody in the room. I'm not quite sure how well you'll be able to see this. And we have since produced a new map. But with this, they were taking the tail end of this, they were gonna come all the way over, take the tail end. This is the walkway into the cemetery. So if you notice, there's no other access to the cemetery. So they were gonna completely cut off access to the cemetery. And they were gonna also take a portion along the fence line closest to. However, where the problem came in is that we galvanized as a community, and I say we now because I'm now on the board of trustees for the cemetery. We, along with the younger descendants of the people who had started the Benevolent Society, as well as members of Cabin John, formed an informal group to basically fight during the Section 106 process. And in the process, we also found a pro bono lawyer. So we were able to take the defunct order and bring it back. So we are now an actual functioning entity of the Benevolent Society once again. Unfortunately, in the course of our fight, what we have noticed is if you see along the red line between that and the actual 495 highway, we fought MDOT to do GPR. And what we actually found was exactly what we were worried about. There are burials that go all the way up to the highway. So currently what we're fighting is MDOT has said that they would have no adverse effect to the cemetery. And what we're arguing with them is that the historic cemetery actually runs up to the highway and no expansion should be done at all in this area. And we have identified as many as 20 burials that they are still arguing that there's no impact to the cemetery and want to basically move along with their process and enact kind of the process of, if you find burials, then moving them into the cemetery, while also at the same time agreeing that they're going to give us this portion of land and have us as the owners. So there's a lot of issues kind of going on, but this is some of the ways in which archaeology turns into social justice, and we look at sustainability. The other things we've argued with them about is the rainwater drainage. They also have a huge drain that they built in the 1960s that's in the middle of the cemetery. So looking at fixing that, the environmental impacts of the damage that they've done, the soil that they've placed in the cemetery, helping us replant native shrubbery in order to protect this area from erosion. In addition, we've run a number of youth programs throughout the cemetery. So how to do work around identifying headstones, cleaning headstones, advocacy, and just learning about the cemetery as well. And then we did a photogrammetry project in which we partnered with Montgomery County Archaeology Division, and we taught volunteers how to do photogrammetry to help record headstones throughout the county of Maryland as well. So this is just one of the projects and when I work at, in which we're employing a sustainable model. Another way is AITC has operated as a nonprofit entity so that the cemetery could raise funds in order to preserve and kind of upkeep. So since that has been enacted, the cemetery has been able to receive grants to do bamboo remediation and to do various things in order to help it to look more contemporary and be a place that's inviting where descendants can actually come. So this is just to give you a picture of what the cemetery currently looks like, and some of the differentiation amongst headstones. We also have just quarry rocks. And since the GPR has been done, it is known that there are over 200 burials in this cemetery. And these are all the community members, the orders, trustees, and some of our education and advocacy. Since then, we've also continued research, and we've been able to identify those who've been buried in the cemetery with the partnership of the descendant community. So another project that I is near and dear to my heart is the Estate Little Princess. This is the site of one of the oldest and best preserved sugar plantations on the island of St. Croix. It has an occupation spanning over 200 years. So it made it an ideal example for understanding the rise and fall of sugar production and dynamic life of enslavement in St. Croix, especially during the era of Dutch colonization. The structures here, there's a number of surviving structures, which also make it nice because you have a hospital, which is located here. You also have the enslaved quarters that are still standing. So if you look at this map, we've actually mapped out the enslaved quarters, which are number 8. So you see all of the quarters that are still existing. Oh, wait. And so this is one of the enslaved quarters right here that you can actually see in this bottom picture. So because I am archaeology and I know a lot of what I talk about is people-centered, I just wanted to throw a really cute picture of artifacts just so you could see some of the cool artifacts that are being uncovered while this work is actually being done. And then we have a unique setup for our project. So for our project, we actually have we set it up where we have 5 co-PIs, and recognizing that we're trying to democratize the work of archaeology and not just have one sole person who takes all of the credit for all of those working on the project. we thought working together as a collaborative is a much better way. Thus producing publications. We can also raise voices, and each person comes to the project with a different expertise level that others don't have. So versus a project where you might outsource or bring in just a person, but they're not actually getting credit for the work on the project, we wanted to create an environment in which everybody was, and then also allowed us to have more power to help the community and to actually have a more sustainable project. So in this, our collaboration is with a number of programs and organizations on island and off. So Diving with a Purpose helps with our ecological work, National Park Service on island, Junior Scientists in the Sea. We work with the Boys and Girls Club, the Natural Museum of African American History and Culture, CHANT, which is the Crucian Heritage and National Tourism, and the Society of Black Archaeologists as well. So what does the sustainable archaeology model look like in this project? So community stakeholders are partners in the formation of the research design. So all of those people you saw listed below, we talk to, we get their input. We want to understand what they want. Countering the environmental impact of archaeology with local environmental restoration. So because we have to clear a number of trees, and if you know anything about an island, when you're taking trees off, hurricane season comes, it destroys. So we actually work with the Nature Conservancy. So we've had coral reef restoration programs. All of us, except for 2, are certified underwater divers. We've had programs where we've trained local youth to be divers so they can continue that work. So that's where Junior Scientists in the Sea comes in. In addition to that, we've had beach cleanups where we've helped clean up some of the seaweed that's washed up on the beaches of St. Croix as well. Natural and cultural heritage stewardship. So working directly with different entities and talking about how the artifacts are curated, where they're curated, what's the process, but also going a little bit further in offering our services to local organizations. So some of our graduate students that come in then go on to work with and help. So directly with CHANT. So one of our graduate students is writing for a heritage grant right now with CHANT to help them do work around Free Gut, which is the free African American community in Frederickstead. And then training local stakeholders in archaeology heritage practice and creating job placement opportunities for students. This is one in which I directly employ through AITC interns every summer. So we do a fundraising drive every year in order to pay high school students to come back and be interns. And these are interns that were trained in the summers before, as we were doing archaeology, to come back and help train new students, as well as learn new skills as well. So the training, I handle one segment of the training, and this is the youth training. So I have 15 students every summer that come and excavate with me from the Caribbean Center of Boys and Girls. So I train them for a week doing archaeological curation. We also cover lab analysis, oral history, writing. And then what we do is we have a public day at the end. So the 4 in the middle are students that I've actually had for 3 years now. And they come back, they get paid every summer. They are our tour guides on our public day. So it's a pseudo day of rest for us as the actual archaeologists, and we let our junior archaeologists take over. So the community comes in, the students give them a tour, the students explain the artifacts, they talk about what we found, they give the full history of the site and the work that has been done to date. Another aspect of this is the UC HBCU initiative. So Justin and Ayana have been in the UC system and they applied. So we have HBCU students that come out. And at the first summer we ran it in Haiti and in St. Croix. So I did double duty that summer working in Haiti at Sans Souci, training students in Milo. So this picture right here, I, for a straight week, taught up to about 25 students a day And these are kids who just lived in Milo, how to do archaeology, what archaeology was, inviting them to learn more. And while doing that, I trained 2 Haitian archaeologists on how to do this work. So just kind of accomplishments to date, just of this project and what some of the outcomes. 2 students have been employed at local dive shops, so incorporating the underwater archaeology aspect and terrestrial. 3 students work for MPS Youth Conservation Corps. 50 students trained in archaeological techniques through the field school. There have been 4 paid interns who return to the program every summer to get paid. 15 students receive paid memberships into the St. Croix Archaeological Society. So last but not least, as if I don't do enough, I'm also the founder and executive director of Archaeology in the Community. And Archaeology in the Community is an archaeology education nonprofit. And basically our sole mission is to train all the students of the world of all ages about archaeology education. And this is done in just about every format and every possible way you could think. Currently, we're running an archaeology club where one of my big things is being equitable and making sure that I give all students access to archaeology. So the archaeology club is completely free. It runs for 5 weeks. It has field trips. We do everything. This particular iteration, we have 3 students who are deaf, as well as 6 of their siblings participating. So we have partnered with ASL translators so that our students would be able to participate in our programs and wouldn't feel left out. Just because it's free doesn't mean that we aren't completely accessible for all. So thinking about how we kind of create these programs, who we create these programs for, and how inviting we are, we also created a virtual iteration of this because what we realized was there was a larger need of people who aren't located in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. So our virtual club is also free, and we ship all of the boxes of all the supplies and everything that we're doing in person to our students a week before the program starts. So even though you're virtual, you get the same experience that our students who aren't would get. We also hold an archaeology festival every year. We partner with a number of organizations. We have mentorship where I personally train archaeology students who are looking to do community work or who want to learn how to do working with students on how to do that, what that looks like, because it's very different teaching and working with students than it is with adults. And it takes a special skill set that I don't think most people recognize until they actually host a program for youth. So when we talk about the future, sorry, trying to wrap this up because I know I've been talking quite a while. When we talk about the future of AITC is we have 3 programmatic peers. We do internships, professional development, youth programs, and then kind of overarching community programs. We have recently partnered with SEAC to create the African American Historical Resources Project. This is where we're pairing archaeologists who volunteer their time with African American communities who need help around particular resources, whether it's genealogical help just identifying who does GPR, just questions, archaeology questions that they just haven't been able to get answered. We pair them where archaeologists have already decided to volunteer their time with these archaeologists and let them work together to just see in what capacity they can help each other in order to strengthen engagement.